A very good evening, everyone from Singapore, and thank you for joining us for this conversation tonight from many different parts of the world. My name is Valentina Riccardi, and I'm heading the Culture Department at the Asia-Europe Foundation, ASEF. I'm delighted to welcome you tonight, together with our partners, the Australia Council for the Arts and Transit Projects, and our speakers, to take part in this conversation on the topic of international cultural cooperation in post-pandemic recovery. I would also like to thank UNESCO for selecting our proposal to host this roundtable as an official side event of Mondiacal 2022, the Conference on Cultural Policies and Sustainable Development that we look forward to starting tomorrow in Mexico City. This year, ASEF is celebrating a big milestone, 25 years since it was set up by Asian and European governments back in 1997, with the mission to connect people and raise awareness and mutual understanding about one another. So we thought this would be a perfect time to look back, take stock, and plan ahead. And we decided to do this through a consultative process where, together with our partners, stakeholders, and friends, we attempted to recalibrate the compass by looking at the current scene in Asia-Europe cultural relations and discuss with like-minded organizations possible strategies for a post-pandemic recovery. So our conversation today is very much part of this process too. And we do hope that it will provide us and you all with valuable insights on what it means to work today in international cultural cooperation in this time of great geopolitical unrest and post-pandemic recovery. Without further ado, I will give the floor now to our moderator for the evening, Ray Yo. Ray is International Development Consultant for the Asia region for the Australia Council for the Arts, and he will facilitate our discussion today. Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you so much for the introduction. From where I work in Australia, it is customary to do an acknowledgement of country to recognize the significance and to pay respects to the First Nations people as the traditional owners and ongoing custodians of the land on which we live, play, and work. While we are dialing in from various parts of the globe, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which you are on today and all of us are on today. And I pay my respects to the elders of those lands as well. I also want to take this opportunity to thank ASEF, Valentina, Preeti, and her team, Haichi, Ashikin, Claire, and Julia, for working on the background on this online roundtable session. We all know through our experiences through the pandemic that making an online roundtable happen takes a lot of work and resources. And yet, despite our best efforts, sometimes things will go wrong. So if something does go wrong in our session today, I ask for your patience as we try to get back on track as soon as possible. Without wasting any time, let me introduce all of our speakers of this roundtable today. You've already met Ms. Valentina Riccardi. She's the Acting Director of Culture Department at the Asia-Europe Foundation. And joining her from ASEF is Ms. Preeti Gaonka, Senior Project Manager for Culture Section as well. And then we have Mr. Jordi Balta from Transit Projects from Spain, Ms. Martina Pekova-Cherna, the Head of International Cooperation and of the Arts and Theatre Institute in Czech Republic, Ms. Elada Evangelou, the Director of the Buffer Fringe Festival in Cyprus, and Ms. Lin Fu, an independent curator and consultant from China. So they are all coming online now with their videos. This roundtable session is expected to go on for about 1 hour and 30 minutes. We want to encourage viewers to join in on our discussion throughout the session via the chat box on YouTube. And I've seen now that there are many people who are saying hello and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening already in the chat box. So good job. Our great colleagues from ASEF will also pick out relevant questions and comments throughout the discussion to share with us and our speakers. So if you can, those who haven't yet, please take this time to locate your YouTube chat box And as mentioned by Valentina in her introduction, we had previously held several closed-door roundtables under the Recalibrating the Compass banner, conversations on pressing themes of the arts and culture community in Asia and Europe, with a view to design a new and more resilient participatory approach to the future. Before we start our roundtable, I'd like to invite Jordi, who have been keeping track of each of this roundtable, to share with us a little bit of the key findings of this session before we actually get the thoughts of our speakers today. Jordi, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much, Gray, and happy to be with all of you today. Indeed, as you were saying, in the context of the 25th anniversary of the Asia-Europe Foundation, a series of roundtables called Recalibrating the Compass has been taking place this year. And so far, we've had 4 discussions addressing different aspects of cultural relations between Asia and Europe, and which I believe in many cases are relevant to a broader global context. And you can find on the website of the Asia-Europe Foundation, Culture 360, the detailed reports of each of these sessions, which we'll be sharing a link for that in the next few minutes, but and I would invite everyone to consult that, because there's quite a richness of ideas and lots of very interesting experiences locally and internationally that have been shared. But as an introduction to our session today, I'd like just to highlight a few of the themes that have been running through this conversation. I think the first idea that stands out from the conversation held between cultural professionals across the regions is a very central awareness of the need to revise ways of operating within cultural organizations, the cultural sector more broadly, and in international cultural cooperation in particular. So things like the perception of the need to address labor conditions within the cultural sectors in a context in which we are increasingly aware of the fragmentation of the sector, the increase in self-employment and the precariousness that affects many professionals and organizations in the sector appears very strongly. And similarly, there is also a concern and a lot of interrogation about the effective opportunities that are being put forward and that are being generated for cultural activities to be truly inclusive and accessible to everyone. So there is an awareness of a certain mismatch between discourses which talk about inclusion, access, diversity, and an awareness that not everyone in practice is able to exercise their cultural rights. Other questions that arise in this context of self-questioning and awareness of the limitations and the things that need to change within the cultural sector, for instance, how to revise operations in the context of the climate crisis, and how practices can be made more sustainable and adapted to a context of regeneration and adaptation. The need to integrate the gender perspective also comes up as an important factor in some of the discussions. And also when we've discussed particularly with professionals and organizations in the heritage sector, something that comes up strongly is the need for institutions to be more accountable and more transparent, for instance, as regards the origins of collections, as well as the treatment and the attention paid to minority groups and their collections and stories. A second idea that comes up strongly is the need in a context in which very important questions come up as regards, for instance, how to adapt forms of international mobility in a post-pandemic context and in a context of sustainability, as well as the increasing place of technologies in many exchanges. And very often these conversations are framed in an either or format and saying you either need to stay in your place or you need to be hypermobile. We need to move everything to online context, or we believe that person-to-person exchanges are very important. There is a demand for more nuanced conversations, for more nuanced criteria that help us navigate those complexities, saying person-to-person contact remains very important, but we need to find in which context that needs to take place. So that's also an important point. A third idea that emerges is that in the context of all these deep-rooted discussions and these serious concerns that are being put forward, there is an awareness that we need to strengthen our skills and capacities, and the need for more training, capacity building that helps to navigate these difficult contexts comes up quite strongly. And for spaces of training to be understood increasingly as peer learning spaces. So exchanging experiences between professionals based on an identification of shared concerns and very practical problems. And the final idea that we will certainly be exploring further in detail today is the awareness that we are living in a moment in which a lot of societies are turning inwards and are paying more attention to their domestic troubles, and sometimes leaving aside the importance of international exchange or fearing international exchange. And in that context, there is a demand to say, well, actually, we need to remain open spaces. We need to continue to generate spaces for mutual learning, for enrichment that can be brought about through international cultural cooperation. And cultural professionals have a very important role to play in enabling those encounters to happen and facilitating that richness to continue to be exchanged. So just a few ideas coming from these discussions, but certainly, again, I would invite the audience to check the reports, and certainly many of these issues we can continue to discuss in the next hour and a half. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordi. You know, all you mentioned were keywords that are really, really important to be discussed. And I think, you know, we will touch on some of these keywords, and I feel that they keep on coming back again and again through our discussions as well, with not just the wider Asia-Europe connections, but also globally. No doubt that, you know, it has given us a lot of ideas to think about. And again, you know, I like to call on the viewers to help us, as well as you type in your comments and your feedback as we go through the sessions today. So when you registered for this roundtable, you would have seen the questions that we will be asking our speakers. So I'd like to start off with the first question, and that also has been touched on as well. Given the impact of the pandemic and the last 2.5 and more years, and also the current kind of evolving geopolitical context that's happening, I wanted to pose this question to our speakers. Is it time to rethink cultural cooperation? You know, what are the things that we used to do, and what are the things that you think we should start thinking about? Perhaps we can start with Elada.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from Nicosia. So yeah, it's a great question. So it's always very tempting to think about redesigning a whole mechanism. Unfortunately, we know that it's very complicated, because between community-based work and then international collaboration, it's a very complex system. However, I guess what is the most feasible thing that we can do kind of at this stage and so early after the pandemic is to try to remember, in the same way that we have gone through financial hardships over the last 10, 15 years. Like on our side of the world, there have been crises that have really scarred societies. And many times we do tend to forget how it is that our communities, both our artistic communities, but also the actual societies that we live in, what kinds of changes they've had to go through, societal changes. And in some cases, we've even kind of lost part of our humanities. And this has also happened with the pandemic. So my short response to this is, I don't think that we can change the system or that we have to. I think that it's important if we remember what it is that maybe we have lost in the process, but maybe we have also gained in the process, and make that always part of our design in how it is that we will move forward.
Now that's really good, because you mentioned a few things like, what we've lost and what we gain as well. I'd like to maybe get Lynn to jump in a little bit to talk a little bit about your idea of, whether it's redesigning or whether it's actually relearning the things that we may have lost or gained through cultural cooperation. Lynn?
Yeah, thank you, Gray. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Usually I would start from hello from Shanghai, but here I'm joining you from New York, where I am based now. And I like to start with a very brief visual description, if I may. So I'm an Asian woman in my late 30s, and I have long black hair. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses. I have a round face. Today I'm wearing a yellow cardigan on top of a black shirt. Yeah, so to answer Grace's question and also add a little bit about on Alada's answer just now, I think absolutely, it is really after the pandemic. I know some countries are still living in the pandemic, so it's really important to kind of rethink and reshuffle and reprioritize. These are kind of the three keywords I gave to myself and to everyone. So I'm working as an independent producer and curator in performing arts. So for me, actually, to be honest, I'm kind of losing interest in this conventional, traditional touring, which I did before the pandemic, like 100%. This is what my job was about: bring in international artists and companies to Chinese audience by the end of like February 2020. So ever since the pandemic started, simply you can't do that anymore. And I think if you ask the question to me now, maybe I'm not interested to do that anymore. So during the past 2 years and a half, I've been spending a lot of time to think on, how to create a truly meaningful experience when you do international exchange, bring international artists to the like where I came from, to the Chinese audience, instead of flying them physically in person to present their shows in the theater. Usually, for the conventional touring model, it's hit and run, right? You stay there for a couple nights and that's it. Do your show and then you're gone. But I think during the pandemic, there are many different models coming up. Like we're talking about concept touring, we're talking about slow touring. So these kind of experience that might be more time consuming, that might be a little bit more expensive, but that give artists chance to spend more time on talking to the local communities and creating more meaningful and impactful experience for everyone. So I can add that example later after maybe Martina answered the question, but I'd like to give you an example. I actually just pitched the show to my colleagues in South Korea like 8 hours ago. Sorry, it's a little bit early it's like 6:20 in the morning, so I might be a little bit, not really, I don't try to really stay super alert. And then, so that show gives a very good example about the, what's the possibility of the future of touring. And I guess a lot of the artists are also exploring in that field, inspired by the pandemic. Yeah, I'll let you guys know a little bit more later.
Thanks, Lynn. It's an interesting one, because I think the whole pandemic really shifted our senses of what, how physically we are moving things previously, and now it's really looking at concepts like the one that you mentioned. But I want to get Martina's view on this cultural cooperation post-pandemic, or we can't really say post-pandemic because some countries are still in the recovery or in the midst of pandemic. So Martina, what's your thought about the new approach, so-called new approach of cultural cooperation?
Hello, good afternoon from Prague. It's an honor to sit again around the ASEF roundtable, although it's virtual roundtable, but it's nice to be back here after our conversation in May. It's an honor to be present for not only for the Czech Republic, but also for the Central and Eastern European region, because we have many partners we cooperate with in our work. It's necessary to start with the position that I am coming from performing arts. And of course, it is part of live arts which needs direct contact. So of course, we can talk about digital shifts in arts in recent years, not only caused by the pandemic, but still our artists from our branch just wish to meet live with their audiences and to meet. So this is something what is crucial for them, and they are happy to believe that we are in post-pandemic times, although we don't know if it's true. I would say that quite often, and it's funny because here in the Czech Republic, the theater season, which has started in September, started with a row of conferences. We had 7 conferences in 6 days. So actually it shows that it's really absolutely necessary to discuss and rethink the role of culture, the position nowadays times. And one of the words or keywords which was repeated many times was crisis. I don't believe that we are in crisis, although of course COVID is a crisis, the war in Europe is a crisis, energies and inflation situation is a crisis. But I strongly believe that we are already in a transition time. And we are in a period which may cause many crises, but also we have to believe that this transition leads to something positive as well. And here, another word which was many times repeated in our context was care. Care is absolutely crucial in these times, and it is deeply connected with culture, because what else is culture than continuous work to cultivate, to care, and it's a work which must be done. What we discuss here is a new role of all organizations, of all artists, but especially of public culture institutions, which should help to be a platform for understanding of a broad role of culture in the transition in these times and in the transition period of our societies and civilization. You mentioned the climate challenges and all the challenges we are facing right now. What we are facing is the fact that not only individual artists or independent organizations, but also public culture institutions are missing this capacity to be the leader or to be the platform to understand, discuss, and lead this change and new development. And it's something what should be discussed, and it is actually discussed in our context, and we have maybe one positive news that we have also financial resources for that. You know that in Europe, the European Commission introduced the National Recovery Plan for the post-COVID period, and it's maybe surprising that the Czech Republic is kind of champion in this regard, because 4% from the National Recovery Plan goes to culture sector in our country. It's absolutely unbelievable. It's an achievement of many stakeholders in our country and of the public administration and state administration. And just to compare, that it is the highest support, for example, the second highest support coming from the National Recovery Plan for culture is in Italy and France, but when it is 2% from the whole budget of the National Recovery Plan. So it's good news because this transition, of course, is going hand in hand with finances and with the capacity of all the players which are involved. And we are just, therefore, I mentioned that we are maybe in many crises, but we are also in a transition period where we can believe that in these very close years, we will go through fundamental change of the cultural sector.
Cool. Thanks, Martina. I'd like to get maybe Valentina and Preeti to come in at this point to talk a little bit more about actually cross-border cultural cooperation, because, and I want to quote here, we actually, the roundtable and the colleagues got some quotes from artists and curators and festival directors in anticipation and in advance of this roundtable. To get a sense from them as well, what they feel it is important. And Lucy Nemechkova, a festival curator, actually got back to us and said that if you want to keep, and this is her quote, if you want to keep up with your foreign colleagues and maintain a certain level of knowledge, it is essential to follow current developments and trends and to be there to share common experiences, to confirm your participation and the interest that you belong to this family. And I suppose she's talking, or they are talking about the art and the global family. I wonder what you guys think in Asia Europe Foundation, especially when it comes to cross-border cultural cooperation.
Preeti, you want to go first? Shall I? Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I mean, I think ASEF role is at this point in time, it's a very, I would say it's a very interesting time because, as some of the other speakers mentioned, it's a challenging time. We see a lot of imbalances that are exacerbated by the situation of the last 2 years, by many other factors that we can't really control. But it's also a very good moment now for organizations that are working intergovernmentally between regions to really play a role to bring people together, because they have that capacity, because basically they are the one that bridge two different regions or even countries within a region, and also those that can bring in local experiences to, say, a different platform of exchange and and a collaboration. So I feel that it's a really important time, and it's an important time where organizations like ASEF need to really play a role and have a responsibility towards the sector to really do that. Because in good times where everybody is happy and things are working well, probably this wouldn't really be that important. But now when we see these new trends and exacerbated trends, as I said, inward looking, polarizing of different regions, that's where an organization that works across needs to really play a role. And as I said, I think it's also a question of responsibility to really keep the sector alive and continue to create cooperation and exchanges. Maybe Preeti wants to add something to that.
Vali, I would just like to quote two artists, arts practitioners from a different era. The first one is a French photographer, André Cartier-Bresson, pardon my pronunciation. He spoke about that the world is in movement, and you cannot be stationary in your attitude towards something that is moving. And the second quote that I wanted to mention is he was a leading theater maker from India, where he used to always tell us is that the arts sector is really the gauge of society. What I wanted to sort of bring out from these quotes is that things are constantly changing, and the way we cooperate, the way we engage in exchange also evolves and changes while we are responding to these external factors that sort of have an impact at different levels. And in that sense, for ASEF as well, as Valentina mentioned, For us, we've been around for 25 years, and now we are also looking at what shape, form, and engagement do we provide, do we facilitate, where do we come in, and how does our role also change in that sense? I would leave this with like a question, however, is that, but there are certain issues, and this is sort of coming back to what Elada mentioned earlier, and Lynn as well, is that what are the sort of traditional forms of exchange that we had earlier? Was it just like, touring where you get in and get out? And how do we relook this concept of real international collaboration or cooperation? And also when we talk about it, perhaps in conversations, we have a certain understanding of these concepts, but how do they really reflect on the ground? And how do communities really engage with these concepts as well? And I think for us as ASEF, perhaps that's where we come in also, to be able to engage in dialogue at different levels between communities from the two regions, as well as bringing these voices to certain processes, the formal processes, and how we can then facilitate this kind of a dual role between civil society and governments as well.
Thank you, everyone. I think I wanted to touch on just a little bit on the last bit of this question, the first question, which some of the keywords that you have mentioned as well, and I think I want to also bring up some of the points, things like cultural exchanges that is not so much has equality in its center, but it's equity in its center, so that the power dynamics and the power balance between the two parties or multiple parties that are exchanging, that are sharing their knowledge, are also quite equal in that sense. Because I would like to also draw in this quote from Kamini Ramachandran, a storyteller from Singapore, where she also mentioned that it's about being respectful in this imbalance whenever cultural cooperation happens, and approaching projects with humility that will help the arts and culture sector move away from the saving and the rescuing mentality that sometimes comes when there is an imbalance of power and imbalance of influence, for example. And we see this happen quite often, I would say pre-pandemic. I wanted to maybe tease a little bit of your thoughts, speakers, about this power imbalance and how do we address that? Maybe Lynn, we can start with you.
This is a very good question. Actually, I've been reflecting on that quite a lot. Because before I started to work independently, I was working for British Council, a very big international organization, promoting British culture and arts worldwide. So when I was working at the British Council Shanghai office, like many years ago, I remember we talked a lot about, how do we simply do our job? Because as a Chinese nationality, working for a British organization, where is our position? And then, so we had a lot of conversations with our British colleagues, and they say, oh, this is not like they're here to enforce or sell their ideas. Even a lot of the times it's the British Council who brought in all the resources, but they really trying to emphasize how important it is to make the project or the collaboration mutual, so mutually beneficial for each party. Like how to genuinely listen to the other party, what do they want, and then what the council itself can contribute. But actually in the real life, right, it's kind of difficult to really try to achieve that. I always feel a little bit kind of like little bit sensitive, imbalance. There is always not really like 100% equal. This is actually also, I just finished a project like 2 days ago. There is, I've been working on this festival of inclusive culture. It's called Diverse as We Are, shortened as DAWA, D-A-W-A. So actually that project, we received the funding from UNIC, the European Space of Culture. So it's a very big collaboration between Europe and China I think probably the biggest one is kind of cultural collaboration happening during the pandemic in Shanghai. And so when I was working on that festival, and it's very different from what I used to do. Usually it's all the European consulates or the organizations, they bring in ideas only, and then they look for local partners to kind of receive their projects, right? To make it happen as just a venue partners, that's it. But for this project, it's different. It's really kind of horizontal, the working model. So we try to kind of bring everyone together to listen to, yeah, what are your needs? And do you think it's a good way to do it? So I think the good thing is everyone's voice gets to be heard, but actually also I'm talking about real life again. It's super time consuming. And I would say it's kind of, to some extent, is less efficient than the traditional model, quote unquote. So, I mean, for me, I'm still exploring, but I think this imbalance and between different powers and how you deal with that in the real life, right? It is something that you can probably only learn from real hands-on experience. And for me, I think this is something really, really interesting. And I definitely see the difference as time goes by, particularly how we're doing things during the pandemic, and also with, because I think Valentina mentioned about we tend to be inward looking more and more. And this specifically applies to China, because China is probably the only country now in the world that still sticks to zero COVID policy. So travel is still impossible. International travel is super difficult. And then that's why the priority is all about how you kind of move around the people inside and how you do things within the border, because just can't really reach out internationally. So
we'll touch on internal and versus external in a bit, Lynn. But I'd like to maybe invite Elada, Martina, and maybe Jordi also to do like some final comments about cultural cooperation, and very importantly what Lynn was trying to mention, that horizontal, non-hierarchical, or whatever new model of cultural cooperation, global cultural cooperations that's possible. Anyone can just, Elada, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Greg. So I have a couple of thoughts on what Lynn was talking about. So in my context, inequality basically comes from two conditions that are ingrained in the space. So one is the post-conflict condition. So we're inherently a society that it's been broken for the last about 70 years due to violence. So there are all these kind of unhealed wounds that are kind of embedded within our social fabric. And there's basically no effort to try to alleviate or to work through them, and especially through culture. So Jordi was also saying before that cultural rights has come up as one of the trends in one of the previous reports, and how there's this idea that everybody has the same cultural rights is still it's still kind of very problematic and problematized. But we live in a place where not everybody can cross from one side to the checkpoint to the other to go to the theater performance. So these types of broken sites are, they do promote inequality. And also kind of to touch on a point that Lynn made, and it's how cost efficient is it to be able to create a system of dialogue around these contexts. Just kind of to be through one example, to be specific about this. So the Bopper Fringe Festival that I've been running for the past 4 years, and this year in collaboration with a colleague, this year hosts 5 curators. And it also has a partnership with the Festival Academy, which is a global platform for festival capacity building, and it collaborates with the International Community Arts Festival of Rotterdam. That is very costly and very, very labor intensive. And for conditions such as ours, it is incredibly difficult to do. So working in a in these types of conditions at times does require a lot more capacity than one might have, and a lot more hands on deck that we actually have at the moment. And this is something, just kind of to close off, as the pandemic has kind of started to come to a close, so has solidarity funding. So to be able to maintain these types of mechanisms, to be inclusive, to try to fix, all these brokennesses, sometimes it's just, we can't afford it. So these types of inequalities become, they keep being enforced rather than solved through conditions that don't allow us to create inclusive processes. Thanks.
Thanks, Elada. I'd like to encourage you guys to continue to contribute through the YouTube chat box. I can see some already. There are some questions that you guys are asking that will relate to some of our questions later, so I will pick them up in a bit. But I'd like to move on to the second question and kind of pose this to our speakers. The pandemic have seen a shift from an external oriented approach into an inward looking one in arts and cultural practices, which, Lynn, you brought up the example earlier. It could be because people are in crisis management mode. It could be because, it is government imposed, and when the borders go up, you can't do anything much more physically except for looking inwards. And this is where also we hear a lot about works that are about the looking inwards into the community, right? The hyper-local. These are some of the words that we hear. What are what roles can the arts organization and cultural professional play in this regard? And how can we actually bring the focus back to transnational encounters beyond just the national narratives? Martina, maybe we can start with you.
Well, I have to comment that during the COVID time, whenever all the anti-COVID measures were released, at least a little bit, we witnessed a huge boom of all live events you can imagine. So it was very obvious that people need to meet, that they need to live cultural life. And the same was it also with in conversations with the artists, when they stressed that, of course, during all the lockdowns, they had to keep their international connections online by emailing and Zooming or whatever. But they were really very impatiently waiting for the comeback to normal operation and normal exchange. Of course, we are talking here about, when talking about international cultural cooperation, it's not only, as Lynn mentioned, about presenting works abroad at festivals or performing arts markets, but it's a very important part of this cooperation is really this relation professional to professional. And it's key part of this job, which is supported by various organizations like ASEF or us as state governmental organization financed from the Ministry of Culture. Of course, we can mention all the impacts and benefits of international exchange, such as professional growth, education, gain of new skills, raise of competencies, raise of expertise, economic impact, whatever. But it's great that we chose for this roundtable also the quotes from the artists, because you picked one from us, and I can also mention the others because they are supposed to deliver reports when we support them in international activities. And I think it's necessary also to stress that it has an emotional part, and arts and culture, it's an emotional experience. So this is really a very important part of that. So when I was going through the reports of artists or culture managers, which were sent abroad to some professional events in the last years, I saw the words like encouragement, feeling of being part of a community, euphoric meetings after years of emailing and Zooming, be part of the family, as you mentioned in the quote by Lucie Němečková. So it is very important part of international exchange. And what is important for us as culture organizations, which are supporting artists to do this international collaboration and exchange, is to keep dialogue with them and to understand their needs. For example, in our institute, we have a specific mobility scheme, which is called the short-term mobility program. A little bit more attractive name is Go and See, and that's exactly that. We provide a possibility for artists and culture managers to go to professional events such as festivals, workshops, conferences, professional meetings, project meetings, to go and see. And that's exactly what they need. It's not only that they have to go to perform their work and to present their work. They need also to meet, to understand the global trends in the cultural field. And they have to choose also by themselves where they want to go and what they need to see and which countries, for example, to visit, when we are speaking also about some special directions of the collaboration between West and East or South and North. So we have this program, and how we proceed with our other activities is to complete this program with other activities which accompany these destinations and events chosen by the artists in the short-term mobility program. Besides this program, we organize, for example, the so-called pro visits, which are special territories, destinations, events, partners we collaborate with, and we stimulate, moderate, and balance also geographically, in terms of genres, in terms of topics, what artists propose to us, where they want to go, where they want to gain their expertise, where they want to develop their skills. So it must be both, like constant dialogue with the community, with the artists, what are their needs, and completion with our expertise, because we also have our partners, our networks, our source of information, and to stimulate also these ways and kinds of collaborations.
Thank you, Martina. I'd like to also highlight, I guess, before I move on to the other speakers, the idea about glocal, and one of the comments within our YouTube also mentioned that. I want to combine that with a comment from Jayachandra Palazzi, the Artistic Director of Artakalari Center of Movement Arts in Bangalore, India, where he says that transglocal processes and mechanism of creation and reception of artworks that are suitable, often immersive and interwoven with environmental sensibilities are in needs in our time. I suppose, you know, in really looking at across the genre, across all the disciplines, and across that local, global border, the line drawn. So such initiatives should be very mindful about the local needs. This is where, again, we go back into the local, but at the same time, firmly embedding themselves in the larger global art scene, you know, transcending the trappings of parochial views and prejudices. I wonder if you guys, you know, Valentina, Preeti, Jody, have any comments about these type of like initiatives that are also not just embedding themselves locally, but globally, in order to kind of dismantle certain prejudices about working in the arts and culture?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that role of bridging the local and the global images very strongly. And I think there's an increasing demand for cultural organizations and cultural professionals to strengthen their role as mediators. And of course, the role of mediation has multiple meanings, and it has to do with, say, facilitating processes of engagement at the local level and finding ways to make the content of cultural projects and cultural research more accessible and easy to interpret, and to bring together languages of different disciplines. But it also has to do with that ability to connect the local and the transnational and help to identify what is common across societies. And I suppose somehow building on some of the points that other speakers have made, is that need to cultural organizations increasingly help identify the human connections that exist across societies. And there is a very important role, I think, for cultural organizations to somehow highlight stories and narratives and knowledge of other societies that can emotionally touch local audiences and generate processes in which communities from different parts can encounter one another. And I think to a certain extent, that is also something that is aligned with those demands in the pandemic and post-pandemic context for slower relationships and different forms of engagement with the local. But definitely that is part of a much complex relation with the global as well. The second element that I wanted to address here is somehow also to highlight the political dimension that those elements have. And I think to a certain extent, the context of the pandemic also raises the important questions about what kind of society we want. And I think to a certain extent, there's a lot that can be shared between the ethics of cultural cooperation that we are talking about, and processes that are educational, that have to do with caring for one another, that have to do with placing the importance of health and well-being at the center of our societies and so on. And of course, that comes into a certain conflict with other ways of doing that highlight the inertia of continuing business as usual, and which call for going back to normal. So I think in that context, and also placing this conversation in the broader context of the Mondial Cult discussions this week, I think what also matters is to reinforce the importance of culture in the kind of society and the kind of world we want to build. And one of the things that will be discussed at Mondial Cult is to what extent culture should be understood as a public good, just as we understand that education and health and other elements are public good. So I think, let's say, each one in our specific corners and in specific contexts and local contexts, that is also part of that global conversation. So I think there's also a role for cultural organizations to somehow help see that what we are doing locally is part of this broader global conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jordi, for providing that context as well. Just before we move on to the last question, I was wondering whether Elada, Lynn, you mentioned earlier about, the borders and inward looking. Preeti, did you guys have any last comments or feedback about, this local, global, transnational, and the importance of culture in playing that kind of bridging and being the connector?
Yeah, I can just say a little bit more. So I think it's very important to kind of prioritize the most relevant areas of interest. So for different countries, for example, as I said, China, where I came from, is more and more inward looking. And then actually compared to 10, 20, 15, 20 years ago, it's getting more and more difficult to conduct international cultural exchange, because sometimes, the censorship is getting stricter, and then there's just more and more supervision from different sources. Simply, your life, if you're working in international field only, is quite challenging at this current political era. So that's why it's very important to know what is interest. Like Gray, you mentioned the local interests. What do they want to do? So try to find like a good match, so you can really put both sides together and make things happen. So for example, for Dawa, because it talks about disability, it talks about inclusion, and disability is still quite not really such a well talked about area in China when you talk about disability arts, is not that well developed compared to, Europe or North America or Australia. So this is something that local partners are interested in. They wanted to learn more. So that's why there is this need, there is this opportunity that European countries, international partners can bring in their value. And then things that, because that's something they really want to learn, and that's how we made it happen. Even the process, it takes a year and a half, and there's a lot of going back and forth, last minute rescheduling change because of COVID. But yeah, overall, this is a really good learning experience for everyone. And then you really try to find the kind of area that, not like a crack, but sort of like that, something, if you really want to make this project happen, try to find this area of interest that you can focus on. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. We're going to move on to the last question that we have. I think, it's going to be a great discussion, this one, because I feel that, in the last 10 years or so, the idea of the global South and the global North is increasingly becoming more and more prevalent in our consciousness, especially in the arts and culture sector, which we all work in. And the idea about how the global North and the global South are increasingly disconnected. I would even add to say that it's not so much disconnected, but the relationship is becoming more fraught. And the reason why this relationship is becoming more fraught, it's because of the various different atrocities that has been committed, by the global North is now coming to the fore. It's more and more we're seeing, the power shift is trying to balance itself out. The tipping points, we're reaching there. We're seeing more and more, repatriations of stolen goods, of cultural goods, for example. We are seeing more claims of wanting to have, some kind of reimbursement or some sorts like that. How can this be addressed in the international cultural exchange area? We all work in culture. We all know that it can be used as a tool to address this increasingly fraught relationship. I wonder if you have got any thoughts or comments about this, kind of unstable yet really, really important role and relationship. Elada?
Yes. So I'm a person that actually as an academic, I work mostly in the North, and as a practitioner, I work mostly in the South. So I am a great example of a split personality right there. But there are discussions that I bring into both my academic work and my practical work, like from one space to the other. And this, this kind of comparative, I guess, ease. I think I'm one of the lucky ones. I can shift from one to the other. That teaches me a lot. And as a practitioner, what I think I see is that, to a great extent, the disparities that we see in the cultural scene in Cyprus and in the Eastern Mediterranean, and in the Mediterranean in general, I think, because we are a pond with kind of very, very similar types of trends in our cultural lives. What I find to be the most, I would say the most important challenge is how the cultural sector relates with funders, with larger cultural organizations, that are based in the North but want to do work in the South, or international aid organizations. So that relationship, what I see and what I understand is that it hasn't changed very much. And also the types of mechanisms that are put in place to help the global South when it comes kind of to our cultural life is also not something that I see has evolved. So I think that a relationship needs to be built that is more honest, a relationship that is more consistent, relationships whereby different agents, practitioners, cultural organizations also based in the South, but also academics themselves need to be kind of part of this dialogue. So this is on the one side. And now from my practitioner self, working mostly in Europe and the US, what I see a lot of the time is also the way that we understand and we write about decolonization. Most of the times is very, very much it very much comes from the North. So the dialogue on the academic level needs to be democratized a little bit more. I feel that the pandemic has helped us on both of those fronts, but it's things that we forget. It's things that we forget, that when now we organize a conference, not everybody can come. When we organize a festival, not everybody can come. How is it that we keep creating these mechanisms of solidarity within both worlds? And yeah, like North-South, it's a work in progress, and we shouldn't forget. We tend to create small islands, both of intellect and of practice, islands that are very kind of secluded unless we create the bridges. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Alada. Really, really interesting metaphor that you gave there. Preeti, is there anything you'd like to add to this global North, global South divide that seems to be getting larger and larger?
Indeed. Okay, let me come in here as someone from the arts sector from India. In terms of these kind of terminologies that are used as well, these need to be looked at deeper. What is global North? What is global South? How is that perceived by people in the global South? What is the origin of this terminology? And that I think requires some deliberation, and how it's then applied to, say, the practice, and how does it really impact our ability to collaborate, to cooperate within the regions of the North and South and between. In a way, there is this new development of South-South cooperation, which I guess is a great way of engaging with perhaps for countries which have similar histories, shared kind of similar challenges, so that it gives that's a kind of a development on the positive side. What happens to the cooperation and collaboration between the North and South? It still kind of remains traditional in many ways. However, like what Alada and Lynn have mentioned already, is that we need to look at how culture relates to these terms, and how do we look at funding mechanisms and the systems that are set up, and how they impact the culture sector. Because for the arts and cultural practitioners from Asia and Europe, in our context, for instance, I think using terms which are somewhere where the base is more economic kind of factors being brought into these conversations requires a little bit more assessment, especially with what Martina mentioned earlier, was there is emotion which is involved in the work that we do, and how does that get reflected in these kind of hard factors which come from economic perspectives.
Thanks. That's really, really helpful, Preeti. And I will come to Jordi in a bit, but I also want to bring up some of the comments that we've been receiving on YouTube about something that you touch on, Preeti, not just looking at, North and South, South and South, North and North, but actually, are these comments helpful? Are these categorizations helpful? That's one. But also, what about individual countries that are also going through, similar or on its own unique way, it's geopolitical conflicts that are throwing itself out of balance, and how does that actually reconnect? I wonder, Jordi, if you can also help us, speak to us a little bit about some of your thoughts when it comes to, the imbalance, when it comes to the dynamics of working geopolitically when there is all these other factors involved, all the factors that Preeti have said.
Yeah, I mean, just a thought. I have the feeling that over the years, and particularly in the last few years, there's been quite a number of reflections in different corners that have tried to set up some basic principles, some guidelines to revise forms of working. in international cultural cooperation, integrating principles of fairness and of equality. And I was thinking, for instance, of the NOT toolkit that was developed or commissioned by UNIC on fair cultural cooperation just last year, of work that has been done by Dutch Culture on fair cultural cooperation within the museum sector in the context of the reflections on the return of artifacts and so on. There's been a number of conversations and some initial steps that are being adopted. And then, of course, this also brings to mind the notion of preferential treatment that was integrated in the Convention on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions by UNESCO, which basically says countries in the global north should give particular privilege to professionals as well as to cultural goods and services from countries in the global south. So I have the feeling that there's quite a lot of general frameworks that provide orientation on how these should operate. And often, let's say, what we need to do is to connect those general frameworks with specific practices. And I think there's two important tasks there. One is, on the one hand, supporting processes of learning and of practical implementation. And again, those processes of capacity building, of peer learning gain particular importance here, and of dialogue and so on. And then the other thing is highlighting the role that networks and regional organizations might have in facilitating somehow the dissemination of those processes and of, let's say, and that's probably also a shared responsibility. And I know it's easy to say and not always easy to do, but of somehow making sure that that knowledge that has already been generated does not remain isolated, but somehow is socialized and disseminated so that we don't reinvent the wheel. And again, this is on the basis of the fact that I think there's quite a lot of reflection that has already existed, and the energy should now be on translating that into effective practice, I think.
Thanks, Jordi. Before I get more of the feedback and thoughts from the speakers, I'd like to read out another quote from musician Kai Altman about cultural exchange and this idea of they said that many times there is this myth of cultural exchange, this idealized format or platform that is created for and it sounds especially good when attracting institutional funding or PR, or even inviting people from places onto the project. It feels right and fruitful, but actually on the ground experience can be very different. It can be, they say that it's a systemic soup and that it can get messy. And I wonder what you think about this messiness, when it comes to cultural cooperation that we are talking about here. Because again, it's very, very attractive when we talk to funders and governments and institutions where they have a idealized utopian framework of, when we bring culture together, everybody will be happy. But on the ground, when you implement it, I'm sure, Martina, your experience as well, being the Director of International, can you talk to us a little bit more about your experience when it comes to, I guess, entangling or untangling the messiness of cultural cooperation?
I like what Elada mentioned, the word work in progress and islands of all these activities, because that's exactly the messiness, which is in that there is no system, because there are many activities overlapping and many interests overlapping. What I would like to comment at maybe is the global south and global north. I think in our context, as we are quite a small country in the middle of Europe and with the big wound of the Iron Curtain from the pre-1989 times, it's not so much a topic for us. I think that also, unfortunately, I have to admit, with the start of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, the topic of East and West has started to be again present in the socio-political discourse, which is really bad because when we imagine that we entered the European Union in 2004, we shouldn't discuss these things anymore. But of course, the geopolitical situation in Europe has changed, and this must be taken into account. What I wanted to link to the international cultural cooperation is the fact that since the war in Ukraine, we have had a lot of Ukrainian refugees in our country, and the response of culture sector was giant solidarity, giant really need to help to these people to integrate cultural professionals into Czech community, which was far beyond the capacity and the potential. And it was really huge response. But when I want to be a little bit bad to the local community, when I ask about the previous waves of refugees from other parts of world, we weren't such a really receiving country with open hearts and open minds. So with this link, I want to refer back to the topic of Global South and Global North. Although it doesn't seem that it is a topic or such a big topic for us, it is present because we are part of the global community, we are part of the global family, and we have to look also behind our borders and behind our regions. So that's very important. And here, of course, it is a very sensitive and very difficult work of culture organizations, how to stimulate such a cooperation and how to balance, again, this word, how to balance. I wanted to mention it, an important role of culture. Gray, you mentioned the beautiful world where all the artists cooperate and this ideal. Culture has another role yet, and arts is not only the beauty and emotional or educational experience or whatever in this like positive direction, but it should be also a troublemaker. It should really bring problems on the table. It should cross the boundaries. It should cross the comfort zones. And here again, this is the zone where we can discuss these big topics of global politics, of global civilization and global society. So it's also important to stress that, and Lynn mentioned also the censorship. Here we have on mind that this will happen and must happen also further.
Thanks, Martina. I love it. I love it that, not only that it needs to culture and arts can be used to, bring on positivity, but in a way also, create that trouble and highlight certain, things like inequality, injustice in certain societies, and show, maybe sometimes the prejudices that we have in our society. Lynn, maybe I can go back to you a little bit more to talk a little bit, in your experience about whether it's using the work and your experience in addressing inequalities through international engagement and international cultural cooperation.
Yeah, sure. I really like what Martina just said, because arts is not just about making the audience feel comfortable or like appreciative. I think I heard a word irritatement at a conference a few years ago, and I love it because sometimes something you watch, maybe it's provocative and something you feel not that comfortable about. And then from when you start to think and you start to question, you start to challenge these kind of like ideas you are used to, but maybe they're not really right. So I think this is also a very important role of arts. But I think, unfortunately, in China, because of censorship, I didn't really get that much access to that part of the arts. So I think I want to kind of go back a little bit to the terminology of global North and global South. Growing up in Shanghai, this is kind of, when I first heard of that term, I was like, why? Because I grew up, I heard mostly it's about West and East, right? And later, you can also talk about the division between inside and outside, and it's a division, this divide of left and right. So so when I first heard about this South and North term, I was like, interesting. But actually divide and this kind of imbalance, it exists everywhere, like in different aspects, politically, geographically, culturally, financially, right? You name it. There are so many of them in our everyday life. And also, I think also Martina mentioned earlier about this emotional side of arts. I think maybe it's not a little bit cliche, but well, compared to hard sell, we tend to go to arts, which is a soft power, softer, to kind of, it tend to be more effective, and because it touches directly on people's heart and then feelings. So that's something, that's why, when we talk about cultural collaboration, cultural exchange, usually it's about, arts itself that can really try to, get the communication flow and then really get your message crossed. And here I'd like to give an example about actually a peer learning community that I came across a few years ago before the pandemic in 2019. That's a platform called APP, Asian Producers Platform. When I first came across that, I feel, oh, wow, this is really the first time finally in Asia, we have such a community bringing in all the producers together, because back in the days, it's all about like all the Asian colleagues. We don't really meet in Asia. We meet in Europe. We meet in Australia. We meet in somewhere else. So this kind of really Asia initiated platform, and to bring in producers across Asian countries. We also have Australia and New Zealand as part of the platform. And the next camp will be an in-person gathering taking place in April in Thailand next year, which is really exciting because Thailand, to many of colleagues in our field, yeah, we've been there, but as a tourist. So very few of us really know about much in terms of the arts and cultural landscape. So that will be a very good learning opportunity for all of us. But interestingly, our working language will be in English, which might not be that comfortable for a lot of the colleagues coming from like China, Japan, Korea, all in the field. But I think this is still, we're kind of trying to shift the terminology or the perspective from Eurocentric to not like Asia-centric, but kind of to include more ideas originally coming from Asia. But I think so far the language we use will still be English because it's still the most common working language, although it's not really kind of ideal for every one of us. But I just want to give this example to kind of respond to, I think, the peer learning like Jordi just mentioned, and things are really happening inside Asia, some kind of self-organized platform that we didn't really see probably 5 years ago. So I think when we talk about Global South and Global North, in addition to the exchange and communication between the two parts, there are also, like, I think we mentioned that earlier, what's happening inside the Global South, what's happening inside the Global North, because inside this one part, there's also so much diversity, and then there are also so many gaps that we need to bridge.
Thanks, Lynn. That's actually a really, really good example. But also, I think you have a knack of actually, helping us to segue into our next section, really. We are moving on to the Q&A section, and I'm going to pick out some of the comments that you guys have really helpfully shared in the YouTube chat section. So the first one actually was something that Lynn touched on earlier about, using arts and culture as a way of soft power, soft diplomacy. So one of the comments that we got was actually asking what's I guess the difference, or can we see cultural exchange and cooperation in this global context also as a form of like cultural diplomacy and soft power? It's not a buzzword. It's been there for a while now. It's how the countries and the government use arts and culture in an instrumentalized way to appear more attractive to the peers and everyone else in the world. I wonder if Jordi, again, you can help us kind of set some context and talk a little bit about your thoughts when it comes to soft power and cultural diplomacy as one of the questions from our chat box.
Yeah, I mean, I think this probably would deserve a lot of space and longer discussions, and there's many more authorized voices to discuss this. But I mean, to put it simply, I suppose there is certainly an overlap between forms of international cultural cooperation and interests of cultural diplomacy and soft power. And there's, of course, many forms of cultural collaboration between artists and culture professionals that are somehow framed and mediated by political interests of very different nature, some granting more autonomy, so a certain degree of autonomy, and others less. I also think that very often, let's say, one same process can have multiple ramifications, and it can serve very genuine and autonomous artistic purposes, while at the same time having the potential to be instrumentalized for political reasons. And I suppose at the end of the day, I mean, on the one hand, there is an importance for some spaces of cultural cooperation to be to develop with as little political framing as possible, but at the same time knowing that in many cases you won't achieve total autonomy. It's also important for cultural professionals to be aware of that broader context, to be able to interpret the implications that taking part in certain activities might have, and also professionally as a sector to somehow foster reflection on a certain kind of ethics of cultural collaboration that tries in so much as possible to escape purely political interests, and to somehow foster that negotiation between a certain autonomy and some form of political, economic, and other kinds of implications that might often be connected to that. So yeah, somehow trying to be aware of that and generate reflections and try to guarantee certain spaces of autonomy, let's say.
Thanks, Jordi. Valentina, do you have anything to add on the idea, being from ASEF and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thanks. Great. Yeah, I mean, the whole conversation about international cultural cooperation and cultural diplomacy, obviously, as Jordi also mentioned, there's a lot of overlap there. I think what is really important is to keep also governments informed about cooperation that is happening without their intervention, because otherwise I feel that sometimes these two levels are not really communicating, and at the end of the day we also want these experiences that are happening on the ground to really come up to a level where they have a voice also in, for example, drafting policies that have to do with culture. So in a way, this goes back to ASEF and other organizations like ASEF and the work that we do, because we do exactly that, or at least we attempt to do that. On one hand, we try to bring together different experiences from very local to maybe intermediate, like a national level, regional level. But then the question is, how are we going to bring that to the attention of governments or people who draft the policies? And that's where our role is also important, and role of other organizations as well. And maybe to just, go back to the bigger topic, I think it's really important, and this is something I feel we learned a lot also from the last 2-3 years, to bring to the table as many actors as possible in the conversation, in the implementation of a project. And that means really from not only the cultural sectors, but also outside of the cultural sector. So people who have not normally been in touch, who are not traditionally speaking to each other, and platforms that allow this should be made available on a very equal level. So again, what many of you mentioned before, how can we bring people together, but removing those labels and those preconceptions, and the fact that they come into something, into a project, really like a new fresh board where everybody can talk and exchange and bring something together that is new. And maybe one more point that I wanted to make is, I think I'm absolutely agreeing with what Martina and Lynn were saying about the messiness of the creative process. I think it also connects to what someone was saying before about change. I think this is a very crucial time when things are changing, and I think this change has to really be embraced, and that means messiness in a way, but then out of that something new, and already some new things are coming out of it. Even these last 2 years, I think discovering that we can actually still be connected online doesn't mean that now obviously we'll drop something and go back to meeting all the time, getting on planes every 5 minutes, but maybe we can combine the two. So innovating in terms of having both things getting together. Just a very small example, but this roundtable series, which I think up to now we've done 4 of them, and each one of them have 10, 15 people. We've already gathered 50 people or maybe 60 people, something that otherwise would be very difficult to do on site, right? So then maybe from this next year, something different will come, will bring us together all physically. So yeah, I think overall, my point, I mean, my initial point, which I wanted to share is to keep the people who are doing the policies informed, get them to know what's happening on the ground, and keeping that communication going, so that then all the voices, even coming from a very, very local point of view, can actually come into that conversation without being instrumentalized, which is another risk that often happens when organizations that are intermediaries maybe catch a lovely idea and then bring it to someone else by appropriating it. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say for now.
Thanks, Valentina. Just a quick one to say that question about cultural diplomacy and all that came from Edith. So thank you, Edith. I wanted to catch on 2 more questions if we have the time. So the first one actually is from Jürgen about balancing cultural cooperation and climate change and climate issues. I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about it. Maybe Alada, you might want to talk a little bit about, how we are as cultural practitioners, people working in the sector, work and deal with repercussions that we are actually having an effect on the planet.
Indeed. So 2 things. One is, I would say, on the kind of overall organizational level, is to acknowledge. I mean, we can do nothing else rather than to acknowledge that what we're doing is in a way detrimental to the environment. So again, we're an island, so we do need to fly people in. And that is something that is kind of inevitable in how we work. But we do really kind of try to own the fact that in order to be able to communicate in this kind of pre and post pandemic era, this is kind of, it's a necessary evil, but we do try to do it responsibly. And also something that was said before, if there will be this type of kind of cultural exchange, it's not like a 2-day kind of in and out type of relationship. It is a relationship whereby people do come, and this is something that we have in our festival as kind of as an ethical basis. So people come in, they spend a few days on the island, they see everybody else's performance, and they also interact. So the performance is more meaningful than a 1.5 hour performance in a specific place. And second, environmental agenda as part of the core of the festival. So less plastic, trying to create sustainable structures for us and our partners and our audiences.
Fantastic. We are running out of time. I'm afraid we won't be able to reach all the other questions that have been posed to us, but I would encourage you guys to continue feeding back to us, because I know that colleagues from ASEF will take these feedback and also incorporate into a lot of the work that they're doing, including the next roundtable as well. So it won't go to waste. We will keep a track of the chat and all the feedback that you've given us. But I just wanted to say that it's really been really interesting listening to our speakers. And, you know, obviously we didn't set out to solve the world's problem with the 90-minute session online with all of us dialing in. But it only kind of remains for me now to thank Jordi, Martina, Lynn, Valentina, Preeti, all the speakers, everyone who's been working hard in the background to keep this conversation going. It's been really, really enlightening for me to kind of hear from all of you, and also to see all the thoughts that has been fed back to us on YouTube. I'd like to thank the participants also, and with that, maybe I'll hand back to Valentina to close off the session. Valentina?
Thanks. Just 2-3 words to close again, to thank everybody. Gray, as an exceptional moderator for tonight, all the speakers who were already part of our first roundtable, and it was great to be able to share with everybody today some of the things that we've discussed. Jordi, who's been with us from the beginning of this journey, Preeti, of course, and all the colleagues in ASEF who are behind the scenes. This is just an au revoir, because we are going to meet again next year in January to summarize this whole process of recalibrating the compass. So please keep looking at our channels, and we will put out the dates for that. And then I hope that we will continue this series of roundtable, maybe touching on different topics, maybe changing our formats, but definitely trying to adapt to very difficult and changing times by providing, you know, platform for exchange and for sharing of different ideas in an equal way, if you want. With this, I'm going to close this evening roundtable. Thank you, everybody, for coming and joining us tonight, and a very good evening from Singapore. Good night.